In October of 2015, the El Faro cargo ship was lost in the Bermuda Triangle during a deadly Atlantic storm. 10 months later, when the black box of El Faro was finally salvaged using state-of-the-art sonar and robotic technology, crucial details finally began to emerge about how and why the El Faro cargo ship sailed into the eye of Hurricane Joaquin and sank with 33 men and women on board. As the sun set on the evening of September the 28th, 2015, the sea was calm as cargo ships prepared to set sail from Jacksonville, Florida. But national weather forecasters in Miami had already noticed a low-pressure system southwest of Bermuda that looked like the onset of a tropical storm. On the morning of September the 29th, the American commercial freighter El Faro left this port with 33 crew aboard. They would never be seen again.
I don't know, and I don't think anybody will know what the captain was thinking during those last minutes, but the crew is probably terrified and wishing they were home, you know.
You can't tell me that sitting at a dock for one day, losing money, is not better than going out in the sea losing 33 lives. Just doesn't make any mathematical sense. It doesn't make any moral sense, and it just doesn't make any ethical sense. It just doesn't make any sense. It's ridiculous.
The El Faro was carrying 400 containers of fresh and frozen groceries, as well as cars and trailers, due to be delivered to Puerto Rico.
The El Faro was on a regular voyage between Jacksonville, Florida and San Juan, Puerto Rico, and it made this trip every week. It would take loaded containers, mostly refrigerated containers, from the U.S. East Coast out of Jacksonville, and it would supply most of the food products that went to Puerto Rico, including frozen chicken, produce, and pharmacy products, and the kind of things you'd buy at Walgreens and CVS. So it was down making its weekly voyage to San Juan, Puerto Rico, and there was a hurricane coming up the Caribbean toward Jacksonville.
A tropical storm dubbed Joaquin by weather experts was already brewing in the Atlantic. But the ship's captain, Michael Davidson, decided to leave anyway, setting what he thought was a safe course 64 miles south of the storm's predicted path.
Now they had two choices. They could have chosen, first of all, to go the short route, or they could have chosen to go the Grand Bahama Canal, which would have added another 12 hours or so to the trip. And the captain made the decision to go the short route, and that turned out to be a very fateful decision. It turned out to be the decision that caused the ship to be in the eye of the hurricane and eventually sink.
At 240 meters long, the El Faro was a behemoth that would have had no problem sailing through rough seas. The ship was one of the oldest being operated by Tote Maritime, and unlike most modern ships, still was outfitted with boilers and steam engines that were often in need of repair. On the evening of the 30th, the ship had already moved into an area of gale-force winds, which would soon become hurricane-force conditions. The last ship to see the doomed El Faro was its sister ship, El Yunque, also on the Puerto Rico route. By the next day, Joaquin had exploded into a Category 4 storm, with gusts of 240 kilometers an hour and rough seas. It had become Hurricane Joaquin, and had also changed course, moving southwest, right toward El Faro. Hurricane Joaquin filled the morning news shows. A ship's captain who sailed the same route for more than 12 years saw the bulletins and grew concerned, so sent a text message to Captain Davidson to make sure he knew about the storm.
There was a second mate who worked on the El Faro who actually was off duty, and he's up in Massachusetts sitting on his couch watching the Today Show or the weather broadcasts, and he actually has cell phone service. And he calls the captain up and says, "Captain, you know, you have a hurricane bearing down on you, and you have some options. You can turn at such and such a channel and go through the Bahamas and avoid this hurricane." And the captain said, "No, you know, I think I'm okay. I think I'm going to be able to skirt south of the hurricane." And that was an error in his judgment.
When you're at sea and a storm arises, then that's when your professional skills come into play. You know, you have to navigate that vessel around and out of the storm. And I've done that several times. I've been a part of a navigation team that has had to go sometimes 600 miles out of the way to avoid a storm because we were already at sea. You can't control Mother Nature, but you can control a ship from leaving a dock going into a hazardous situation.
I think people need to understand that it's very rare for a ship to sink in these days and all the crew to be lost. It's unusual for an American ship to have this happen because of the high degree of regulation of American ships. So no, this is a very unusual event. It's also not usual for a ship to sail in such a way that it would sail through the center of a hurricane. I mean, ships this day and age use weather routing and use other techniques to avoid hurricanes. And typically a ship that was out in the ocean would not come this close to a hurricane.
While I was in the Coast Guard, we were sent into a hurricane to perform a rescue. Well, how do I say this nicely? I was young and dumb and believed that I was in the Coast Guard and we could do anything. And we actually did weather the storm, so the belief was possibly correct, but looking back on it, it was rather dangerous.
Commercial ship captains are often under enormous pressure to make on-time deliveries, even foregoing crucial repairs that might delay an arrival or departure. Their careers are often on the line.
And when you suddenly in the middle of a voyage say, "We're not going to be able to make that scheduled arrival time," you as the captain are under close scrutiny because on-time arrivals are a big thing with a service, a liner service like Tote that runs on such a regular basis.
If he had chosen a different route, if he had gone between the Bahamas and Florida, the voyage would have taken longer and therefore would have cost more money, but it would have been a lot safer.
Danielle Randolph was a graduate of Maine Maritime Academy and the second mate on the ship at the time.
She emails to her mother literally hours before the ship sank, "Pray for us, we're sailing into the eye of the hurricane." So the members of the crew knew that they were doing something that was extraordinarily dangerous. And nevertheless, the captain refused to either turn around or otherwise alter his course to avoid running through the eye of the hurricane.
By early morning on October the 1st, conversations on the bridge revealed the ship was taking on water. The captain used the ship's satellite phone to call Tote Maritime. Incredibly, despite the fact that its ship was in a hurricane, there was no answer. So he left a message.
We have a navigational incident. I'll keep it short. A scuttle popped open on T-deck, and we were had some free communication of water go down the three holes. Had a pretty good list. I want to just touch it, contact you verbally here. Everybody's safe, but I want to talk to you.
Then, only an hour later, at 7:20 a.m. on October the 1st, the ship's captain made an SOS emergency call to the ship's owner.
Yes, ma'am. My name is Michael Davison.
Ship's name?
El Faro.
Spell that? E-L?
Oh, man. The clock is ticking. Can I please speak with a QI? El Faro. I have a marine emergency and I would like to speak to a QI. We had a hull breach, a scuttle blew open during a storm. We have water down in 3 holes with a heavy lift. We've lost the main propulsion unit. The engineers cannot get it going. Can I speak with a QI, please?
The El Faro lost power. So what we know is shortly after losing power, she started to lay broadside to the seas and the wind. We also know the ship was taking on water through some hatch covers. The water that was coming in was causing something called free surface effect, which increases temporarily the tilt that the ship is experiencing, the list. That's actually what probably caused the El Faro to sink in the long run, is a combination of vertical center of gravity, the waves pushing the ship hull over, and the free surface effect.
For whatever reason, the engines failed. And once a ship is in a storm like that and the engines fail, it's at the mercy of the wind and the waves. So it'll go broadside to the waves, it'll start rolling more and more, and then eventually it'll just roll over on its side and take on water and sink.
Without a powered propeller, the helpless El Faro risked being sucked into the eye wall of a Category 4 hurricane. Tote Maritime and the Coast Guard were soon in touch, and a course was plotted for Davidson to try to steer into shallow waters and seek shelter in the small islands near the Turks and Caicos. But when they called El Faro's satellite phone to give the orders to Davidson, there was no answer. The Coast Guard C-130 aircraft sent out to look for the ship during the hurricane encountered the worst weather the crew had ever experienced, risking their lives to search for the lost ship. There had been no communication with the Coast Guard before the cargo ship El Faro, with its 33-member crew, went missing near Crooked Island in the Bahamas during Hurricane Joaquin. However, it was not uncommon for ships to lose communications in a storm. The Coast Guard and families waited as concern mounted by the minute. Kenneth Benton is a merchant seaman who had been on sea watch on El Faro the week before. He had been on the sister ship, the El Yonke, that day to pick up some extra hours of work. He had been in the Tote Maritime office, where tension was rising.
Once I realized that we were, had a, storm in the area, a hurricane in the area, it kind of concerned me that, they hadn't made contact. And I asked the captain, was everything all right? And he said, well, we can't contact the El Faro. I'm like, wow, well, maybe the antennas blew off or something like that. And what really became disturbing is when they told me that the EPIRB had went off. It blipped, sent off one blip, and then there was no more.
Well, the U.S. Coast Guard had gotten some ambiguous signals from the El Faro. They had gotten a single ping on what's called an EPIRB, an emergency positioning radio beacon. And why only a single ping? That's one of the unanswered stories here. The EPIRB is supposed to float free when a ship sinks, and it's supposed to issue continuous pings until the battery wears out.
LaShawn Thomas was an oiler who worked in El Faro's engine room. He had been sailing for 13 years. His stepdad, Pastor Bob Green, remembers when he found his calling.
I remember the first time that he actually sailed abroad. He called me from London, England, and I often tell the story about he called me, he said, "Pops, I'm walking down the streets of London, England, talking to you over the phone." He said, "This is amazing." He said, "I'm never going back."
It was the moment that LaShawn Thomas realized he was experiencing what the maritime community refers to as having salt in your blood.
The old school sailors, or the salty dogs, like they say, they call it having salt in your blood. Once you get the salt in your blood, you have a desire to go out on the ocean. I mean, being on land will get boring after a while. And You know, it doesn't take long to get the salt in your blood, you know. A few years, a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, the lifestyle, the adventure, is nothing that can compare to it.
LeSean had sailed 13 years when he left port for Puerto Rico on El Faro. It was his last voyage.
My wife and I were walking into a restaurant, just out to dinner routinely. And the phone rang and she stopped as we were going through the door and kind of slowed down as she answered. But as what happened next, it was just sort of unimaginable. It was horrifying to know that they had lost communication, they had lost the location, and they were actually trying to figure out where the ship was at this point.
As the hours passed, Tote had to admit its ship had been lost near Crooked Island.
And of course, we're going to talk about now Hurricane Joaquin.
What's the latest? What's happening with Joaquin right now?
We've got to watch the future progress on Joaquin.
A Category 4, the intensity hasn't really changed from the last advisory.
This morning, Hurricane Joaquin is lurching north after lashing the Bahamas with intense winds and sheets of rain. And now a cargo ship with Americans on board has gotten caught up in the powerful storm and is lost at sea.
The Coast Guard sent out a C-130 on a search and rescue mission. The Coast Guard HC-130 Hercules has a wingspan of 40 meters and a service ceiling of 10,000 meters. This aircraft has been tried and tested in every war zone and in the toughest conditions.
My name is Lieutenant Burden, Coast Guard pilot that just finished flying into Hurricane Joaquin, searching for the vessel El Faro. Our search took us within 50 nautical miles of the eye of the storm. At 1,000 feet, the winds were in excess of 100 knots. Visibility was less than 1/4 mile. Cloud ceilings were at 1,000 feet, and the wave height was in excess of 40 feet. Turbulence was moderate, causing the aircraft to climb and descend around 150 feet with airspeed deviations of 20 knots. This was the most challenging weather conditions anyone on our crew had ever flown in.
It turned out El Faro wasn't the only ship caught off guard by Hurricane Joaquin. North of Haiti, the smaller cargo vessel Minouche began to sink in heavy weather. The US Coast Guard safely rescued all 12 crew members from a life raft late on October the 1st. But there was no sign of life from El Faro.
Several hours later, I came to my union hall and the Coast Guard was there saying that they had been conducting a broad range flyover of a grid where they think the last ship was last located, and there was nothing. So I knew that something was wrong, you know, and I was just hoping that maybe they had been blown so far off course that they were just searching the wrong grid, you know, and turned out that wasn't the case at all.
The Coast Guard searched through October 2nd without success. At dawn on October the 3rd, search and rescue responders spotted a number of objects they believed belonged to the El Faro. They narrowed their search to a 582 square kilometer field.
The very first thing they found was a large oil slick. Now, the oil slick is significant for a couple of reasons. First of all, oil seeps very slowly from a sinking ship that's intact. The only place the oil can basically come out is through the tank vents, and the tank vents are fairly small. So if you have a huge oil slick where a ship sank right at the beginning, that tends to indicate that the hull ruptured at some time.
First, a life ring was found and recovered. Then came a more distressing sighting, an orange survival jacket.
We lowered a rescue swimmer into the water. That person confirmed that the body was deceased. It was unidentifiable. So we needed to quickly move to other reports of life. And the reason we have to do that is the ocean is not a static being. It's alive, it's dynamic, it's constantly moving. So when we have reports of other life rafts, life boats, we need to get out there and quickly identify them, see if there's any signs of life. Because if we don't do that right away, then it could sink, it could disappear, we might not be able to relocate it. So again, our focus is on survivors. That's our mission.
They found one body inside one suit. They did not recover the body because it was somebody who's deceased, and they needed to maximize their time in the air to search for survivors. And I don't fault that decision at all. But when they went back to try to find that body, they never did.
As the news spread, seamen and their families braced for the worst. The tight-knit maritime community held vigils.
It was very sad. A lot of tears, a lot of emotion, a lot of anger, a lot of hugs and handshakes, a lot of prayers, a lot of drinking, you know, in the city, you know, as far as the seamen and families, you know, trying to just make sense of, I guess, trying to numb ourselves to the reality of what was to come.
Kenneth Benton knew the crew well. The maritime community is tight, and many of the sailors are not tied to specific vessels, so end up working together.
There was one that I was my good friend, my buddy. Yeah, his name was Roosevelt Clark. He left behind, you know, 3 or 4 kids, you know, a mother, you know, his mother, you know, who really depended on him. He was the type of guy that if there was anything you needed to know about shipping, he knew all the ins and outs. You know, he knew about the payroll and when to write down hours and how to write it so that you don't have any discrepancies. It was just a big help, you know. It was just like having a guardian angel sometime, you know, on the vessel, you know.
The El Faro's operators, Tote Maritime, were questioned for hours on end. Meanwhile, business went on as usual, with El Faro's sister ship continuing to sail the route where El Faro had been lost.
People were angry because they felt helpless. They were angry at the company for not using better judgment, for not taking the lives of the sailors as more of a concern than the cargo getting on time to where it was going. And there was a lot of anger because it seemed like there was a great effort by some to sort of mute anyone who wanted to speak out, you know, about the tragedy.
The National Transportation Safety Board contracted with the US Navy to find the missing ship and, more importantly, its voyage data recorder.
They'll be examining the wreckage which has been recovered during the search and the rescue phase of this operation, and also further wreckage as it becomes available. Our human performance team is hard at work gathering personnel records and scheduling interviews. And to clarify, up to this point, the Coast Guard has been conducting search and rescue operations. The Coast Guard equipment that is used for search and rescue is different from the equipment that will be used to locate the vessel and the voyage data recorder. We are coordinating with the United States Navy to bring in that equipment.
The USS Apache was sent out on October the 19th from Little Creek, Virginia, to begin searching the wreckage and debris field for the lost El Faro. It was fitted with state-of-the-art underwater detection equipment and sonar. On October the 23rd, after arriving at the last known position of El Faro, specialists on board placed a towed pinger locator, known as a TPL, into the water and began slowly traversing the area in a preset search pattern, in hopes of picking up the telltale ping sounds from El Faro's voyage data recorder. The US Navy operates the TPL-25, which weighs 32 kilos and is 76 centimeters long. It is towed below a layer of seawater known as the thermocline, where the warmer surface water meets the colder deep water, creating a wall of water that reflects sound upwards or downwards according to where the source is located. To capture a signal from the bottom of the sea, the TPL has to be towed in the cooler, deep water below the thermocline. The TPL was withdrawn, and instead the Apache put the sophisticated side-scanning sonar system called Orion in the water to try to find El Faro using sonar technology. It is towed behind the support ship at a speed of as little as 2 kilometers an hour. It is 3 meters long, 1 meter wide, and 1 meter high, and weighs more than 1.5 metric tons. Sonar technology creates images by processing reflected sound waves that are sent out by side-scan sonar. These are then converted into a video image. For 3 weeks the Apache searched, sweeping the sea floor and finally narrowing its field of exploration to 500 square kilometers, until, on October the 31st, at last a side sonar scan revealed the dark shadow of a ship. The vessel was located at a depth of 4,500 meters, not far from El Faro's last known position, 39 nautical miles from Crooked Island. To positively identify the wreckage, specialists on Apache sent down the Curve 21, a deep ocean remotely operated vehicle. The inspection equipment dived down into the dark, cold depths, more than 4 kilometers beneath the surface of the sea. What the remotely operated camera saw made headlines nationwide. Twisted, crushed, and scattered remains. The top wheelhouse deck sheared off the rest of the superstructure. A catastrophic structural failure. 1 month after the American cargo ship El Faro disappeared without a trace near the Bahamas in Hurricane Joaquin, the sunken vessel was finally located sitting at the bottom of the sea, 4,500 meters deep, by the US Navy. To find El Faro, the Navy used the Curve 21 sub, specially designed for deep water salvage. Weighing nearly 3 tons, the state-of-the-art remotely operated vehicle, ROV, can work up to 6,000 meters underwater. It usually operates together with the Orion vessel as a single integrated search and recovery system, based on a fiber optic umbilical cable and a shared handling process that can switch at sea between side-scan sonar and ROV operations. The ROV can be controlled in all 6 degrees of motion and adjusts itself according to depth, attitude, and heading. It has a CTFM sonar for locating its target and then detecting it with pings. It sends back images in high resolution from a digital still camera, black and white and color television cameras. How does it work? The system includes a load-bearing pressure-compensated electro-optical umbilical swivel. The whole system of fiber optics can combine up to 8 different channels of video, sonar, USBL, RS-232, 422, 485 data communications, and navigation data on a single fiber. A digital communication network with 400 MHz data capacity controls the vehicle and can be customized to work with all sorts of tailor-made salvage tools. The camera images of El Faro being sent back presented a big salvage problem. The navigation bridge structure and deck below had been sheared off, along with the mast and its base, where the voyage data recorder was mounted. For weeks after locating El Faro, 4,500 meters below the sea on October the 31st, the Navy searched the seafloor looking for the crucial parts of the ship that had separated from the main wreck when it sank. 2 weeks later, on November the 11th, the navigation bridge was found, but the mast and the VDR were still missing. After 5 more days with no luck, the search was called off.
the bridge ripped off of the ship. Now, typically the bridge deck is solidly welded to the house, and it should remain intact. When a ship falls through water, though, it falls very, very rapidly. It's not so different than a piece of steel falling through the air. And so consequently, this ship picked up speed as it was going to the bottom, and the water pressure against the hull was so much that it actually ripped the bridge deck off. So the bridge deck landed someplace different than where the hull landed.
In the spring of 2016, the NTSB turned to the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution for help locating the voyage data recorder, a device roughly the size of a basketball in a 35 square kilometer debris field. The WHOI used 2 unmanned submersibles, the Sentry, which produces high-resolution maps of the sea floor, and an observation vehicle known as Camper, which is a camera sled providing a real-time video link to the research vessel Atlantis above. First, they surveyed the entire area before methodically homing in on possible locations for the recorder. Finally, the mast was located. The Navy managed to detach the capsule from the mast of the ship without damaging it and then bring it up to the surface. It was a miracle salvage of a key piece of the El Faro puzzle. The device includes a voice data recorder that records conversations on the bridge. The authorities were able to retrieve a crucial 26 hours of information, including audio, weather, and navigational data.
I think the tapes are going to provide a timeline. And once you have a good timeline, you can start to fit pieces in. Will we ever know the complete answer? I don't think so. But I think finding and being able to recover the recorder is a big step in finding out what happened.
The incredible salvage of the voyage data recorder proved crucial to understanding what happened to the El Faro. The recording began about 5:37 a.m. on September the 30th, 2015, about 8 hours after the El Faro had left port from Jacksonville. By the morning of October the 1st, the master and crew were discussing flooding and the vessel's list. At 6:13 a.m., the vessel's loss of propulsion and flooding was mentioned on the bridge audio. A telephone call was also recorded in which the captain notified shoreside personnel of the vessel's critical situation. He was preparing to abandon ship.
He said that they, quote unquote, lost the plant. Well, lost the plant is a very ambiguous term. That could mean that they just lost electricity. It could mean that they've lost propulsion, or it could mean that they lost both propulsion and electricity. It was less than 20 minutes later, we know from the tapes, that the abandoned ship signal was finally given. And we don't have any other communications between that phone conversation with the designated person ashore and everybody abandoning ship.
The captain had interesting authority. He had life and death authority. We were used to letting the captain make all the decisions. That's how we arrived at this law. We don't actually have a regulatory approach to say, nope, you're done. Now, when we come inside port waters, yes, the Coast Guard has the regulatory authority to say, you can't leave, you can't enter, you're tied up, or you have to leave. But once the boat's underway, no.
So I think he was afraid. I think he was afraid that if he simply turned the ship around, that he was going to be in the bad graces of Tote, and that was going to adversely affect his career. And when you know you're in your late 40s or early 50s, and the only thing you've ever known is to be a ship's officer or a ship's captain, and that's not available anymore, that's a tough place to be in life. There aren't an awful lot of transferable skills that you can use from being a ship's captain to being in a shoreside job.
According to the NTSB, The data recorder shows the captain sounded the alarm and ordered abandon ship at 7:30 a.m. on October the 1st, 2015. The recording ended 10 minutes later as El Faro sank 39 miles northeast of Crooked Island, Bahamas.
They didn't get off the vessel. They sounded the alarm to abandon ship. But when they looked out that window or tried to open up the, one of the watertight doors, you're talking about a category 4 or 5 hurricane. Now, I was in 70 knot winds. They were in 160 knot plus winds, 160, 180 knot plus winds. I mean, you can't even stand up in that, let alone to try to don what we call a Gumby suit or a water survival suit. You're gonna blow like a balloon. You're gonna blow off. But when I think about it, 12 months after, what the El Faro went through, what the crew went through, it would send chills up my arm, and instantly make me just shed tears, just thinking about the horror that they saw and they experienced.
The sinking of the El Faro was a chain of events, and blame can't be placed on one single factor alone. Many different actions might have prevented the accident.
It was so routine for ships to sail toward what could be heavy weather, there could be storms, knowing and anticipating evasive actions. And I think if we get anything else out of this whole incident, it should be that we can't roll the dice with Mother Nature.
I think that the El Faro illustrated very clearly that the shoreside management needs to ensure that the vessel management understands that it's okay to say no. And there are times when they should say no.
The ship could have been sturdier. Like its sister ship El Yunque, El Faro was often being repaired and was nearing the end of its life cycle at sea. In Marine Board hearings held in early 2016, Tote maritime executives were grilled extensively about safety standards and the ship's age and vulnerabilities. One former ship captain testified that he had many concerns about the safety of El Faro.
I think anytime that you are pushing a ship to 40 years of age, you are asking for trouble. And a ship flexes. It hogs and it sags as it's loaded and it's discharged. And those cycles fatigue the steel and cause welds to break and welds to be less strong than they would be. And then you take a ship that's had this 40 years of hogging and sagging and flexing, and you subject it to a hurricane, and things start coming apart.
Well, the age of the vessel certainly counts because of several factors, one of which is the design. We are getting better in design than we were 30 years ago. Second is construction. The steel gets a little thinner as rust and corrosion take effect.
The 40-year-old vessel had open lifeboats, outdated compared to the enclosed lifeboats of modern ships, which would have increased the chance of survival.
The other thing that happens is the lifeboats become virtually unusable. The lifeboat to the side to which the ship is listing is hanging so far away from the side of the ship that you can't get into it. The other lifeboat on the other side is sliding down the hull of the ship, which makes it very, very difficult to get into and launch. So this listing problem renders the primary life-saving gear on the ship basically useless.
The ship was also due for maintenance, but before departure, Tote had put off repairs on the boilers, engines and structural welding until the next month, when El Faro was due to be retired from the Puerto Rico crossing.
It was old, and above the main deck there's portholes in the boat that are probably about the size of a car door and window, and they go all around, the starboard side and the port side. And I think what I think happened, water got into that and waterlogged, you know, the vessel, and you know, there was it weighted it down, lost propulsion. Hurricane, in the eye of a hurricane, there's no chance. I mean, there's no chance to survive that, you know.
Crew members and dock workers alike complained about the lack of safety on El Faro, which had been retrofitted in an Alabama shipyard in 1993. The process, called jumboization, as seen here in a European shipyard, involves adding a mid-body section to a ship to make it bigger. The El Faro had been lengthened by 28 meters. The Marine Board of Investigation has questioned the vessel's stability and whether there were mistakes in weather forecasting or cargo loading before the ship's final voyage.
The presence of the oil slick is certainly significant. When they actually went out there a little later, they found 2 separate oil slicks separated by a substantial distance. Well, what does that mean? Well, you might suggest that one of the oil slicks happened when the ship broke up on the surface, and the second oil slick occurred when the ship hit the bottom 3 miles beneath the ocean's surface.
It wasn't the first or the last time the company sent its ships to Puerto Rico with hurricanes passing through.
We had a hurricane in Florida that came up the East Coast called Hurricane Matthew. And this same company sent a vessel, you know, out to sea to go from Jacksonville to Puerto Rico during the midst of this hurricane. You know, they said they went out of the way to dodge it, but my opinion is, why not wait a day and let the storm pass and then go out? It just makes sense, but I guess it makes too much sense to do it that way. Or either there's too much money to be lost if you don't get the product there on time. That's the only reason why my shipmates from the El Faro 33 are in a, that's the only reason why they perished, because money was more important.
For mariners and grieving family members of the El Faro crew, hard questions remain unanswered by Tote.
When is the maritime industry going to adopt something like the airline industry has? The airline industry, if there's bad weather, they ground the airplanes. No matter how much Delta or American wants to take off and make that money by flying these passengers, you know, 400 miles away, if the FAA says nobody's flying, then nobody's flying until the storm passes. But in the maritime industry around the world, not just the U.S. fleet, it's up to the company. The companies police themselves, and that needs to be taken away.
The Marine Board of Investigation is expected to release its findings in 2017. In the meantime, representatives of the families of the El Faro victims are continuing to fight for updated maritime safety laws and tougher regulatory oversight for vessels headed out to sea. The families would like to see the ship salvaged and the remains of their loved ones returned, or at the least be allowed to hear audio of what was happening on the bridge.
We really hope to hear the recordings. I was kind of torn as to whether I would or wouldn't want to hear that or experience or relive the moments and hear the voices of the men there. But at the same time, I'm sure that there was an air of professionalism, there was an air of confidence, and their abilities and the techniques and everything probably is what shone through more than anything, I would imagine.
Well, who better to listen to voices and determine what it is they're saying than a family member who's been listening to the voices of these people their entire life? So it seems to me it would make a lot of sense for the NTSB to allow family members to listen to these recordings and try to interpret what it is that's being said on the recordings that they can't decipher.
A memorial fountain and obelisk have been built in Jacksonville Cemetery to honor the 33 men and women who perished on the El Faro. Today, it remains a peaceful place for the families and loved ones of mariners to come and remember the 33 brave men and women whose lives were needlessly lost at sea in Hurricane Joaquin. For more than 80 years, the great Norwegian polar exploration ship Maud has been trapped in the ice in a remote bay of Canada's Northwest Passage, her glorious past frozen in time beneath the frigid Arctic waters she was designed to navigate. Today, a trio of passionate Norwegians have raised the ship as part of an epic attempt to bring her back home to the bay in Oslo Fjord where she was built. Cambridge Bay in winter. Temperatures drop to -40 degrees in the Arctic Circle, just 2,331 kilometers from the North Pole. The flat, white horizon stretches out for miles, empty except for the massive hull of the Arctic exploration ship Maud, resting atop the ice. Maud's story goes back a century. She was the creation of the great Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen, who spent most of his life venturing to the farthest reaches of the globe. He was the first man in history to sail the treacherous Northwest Passage linking the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, and the first person to reach both poles. He had lived with the Inuit for 2 years and learned crucial skills for surviving in the Arctic that would serve him well in 1911, when he became, famously, the first man to the South Pole. For nearly a century, Maud lay beneath the surface of these remote, frigid waters until she was lifted to the surface in the summer of 2016 by 3 ambitious and creative Norwegian men led by Jan Vanguard, a former world windsurfing champion and artist. Vanguard, Bjorn Myran and Stig Petersen hatched an unorthodox, do-it-yourself plan to salvage Maud from the harshest conditions of the Arctic North. 6 years later, they are finally preparing to bring her back home to Norway.
Amundsen was a man who was very good at encouraging or to motivate people to join him on different kind of challenges, and the Maud expedition was developed into a very sophisticated scientific expedition, and today it's considered one of the most important scientific expeditions ever in the polar region.
If something doesn't work, you make it work, always. And Jan, if he has some what do you call it, resistant, it's something that doesn't work, he just put in more energy, and we always come a little bit further. We never give up.
Somebody has to take the initiative, and if it has not been now, it might never have happened.
While Amundsen returned from the South Pole expedition, a hero and in good health, his ship, the Fram, had dry rot and was no longer seaworthy. With his popularity at an all-time high and financiers ready to fund his trip, Amundsen set out to custom build a ship that could reach the North Pole. His plan was to let his ship be frozen in by the ice on the eastern side of the Siberian coast and drift with the ice across the polar basin. Here in Oslo, the Fram Museum holds the artifacts that Amundsen brought back from his polar expeditions, as well as the Fram itself. Amundsen decided to base his new ship on the same principles as the Fram. Throughout the moored salvage project, Jan has come here for vital technical clues.
They took the ideas from Fram and developed them to a better solution for the ice. And you can see it very well that it's a bit different from Maud. The shape of the hull is more like a V shape. And when Maud was built, she was made more or less like a circle in the section. So that's very interesting for us to see.
Norway became independent from Sweden in 1905, and the new king, Håkon, was married to Queen Maud, the youngest daughter of the British king Edward VII. Amundsen decided to name the ship after her, as his expeditions so contributed to the new Norwegian patriotic fervour. Construction began in 1916, here in Vålen, a small town on the fjord south of Oslo. She was designed to be the strongest ship ever, capable of withstanding the crushing pressures of ice plates on the North Pole pressing against her hull. Amundsen hired the most talented shipbuilders of the time, Anker and Jensen, to draw up the first designs. The ship would need a special, rounded, bathtub shape and extra strength, but still be light so it could be pushed up rather than crushed by moving ice flows. It was decided to make the ship broader in the beam forward and narrower astern. The hull could have no cross timbers, but extra special attention would have to be paid to the joinings, shifts and fastenings. 3 layers of oak planks were bolted together, with 12 by 12 frame timbers running from deck over keel to deck. Like its predecessor, the Fram, the Maud would have a retractable propeller that could be pulled up into the ship so as not to be damaged by shifting ice.
They both had this quite smart principle that you could lift the propeller and the rudder up into the hull of the ship. And in this way, when they got frozen in the ice, there was no need for the propeller and the rudder for maybe several years. So to protect them, because they're very vulnerable to the movement of the ice, they could pull them up and protect them from this.
1 year after construction began, the Maud was launched to great fanfares in June of 1917. Amundsen christened her not with champagne, but with a lump of ice. "You are made for the ice. You shall spend your best years in the ice, and you shall do your work in the ice. With the permission of Her Majesty the Queen, I name you Maud." The house near Oslo, where Amundsen spent his Norway days, has been preserved as a museum. Among his belongings are a framed photo of Maud being launched. She would become his home for more than 4 years. She overwintered here in Oslo's main harbour and departed Norway July 1918 with the aim of lodging in the ice pack above the Bering Strait in order to drift across the Arctic Ocean. She had been equipped with scientific instruments from the Carnegie Institution, while renowned Bergen oceanographer Harald Sverdrup was the scientist in charge. The plan was to remain trapped in the ice to drift across the North Pole. During their first winter, frozen in Cape Chelyuskin, Amundsen suffered a series of setbacks. He was attacked by a polar bear, fell into the ice, and suffered from carbon monoxide poisoning. For 2 winters, the vessel was icebound off the Siberian coast, with the men surviving on fish, seal and walrus hunted through the ice. They lived with the Chukchi tundra people and used dog sledges to send crew members out sometimes on 1,500-kilometer long trips, to telegraph stations on Dixon Island and Nome, Alaska, to send news of the expedition to the newspapers.
Going on long trips with this dog sledge, they were very dependent on knowing how far they were traveling. And by having this wheel hanging behind the sledge, they can measure the distance. Each revolution of the wheel is counted on a little register box. So after one day of dog sledging, they can know exactly how far they have traveled.
In 1919, his fellow explorer Oscar Wisting described in his ship's diary the heavy ice pressure against the Maud. The ice cracked and crashed and rumbled, and the timbers of the Maud groaned as the ship shook and trembled. In the hold, we could see how the props, beams and stanchions vibrated, but the Maud suffered no serious damage. With the spring thaw, it appeared the ship would be keeled over. The dogs were shifted to the ice and the sleds packed with an evacuation imminent. But, true to her robust construction, Maud never succumbed to the ice. After forced returns to Nome, Alaska, and later for repairs in Seattle, in 1922 they were ready to make a new attempt to drift over the Arctic Ocean, this time bringing on board a Curtiss plane named Pristine to be used for observation flights over the ice. Filmmaker, pilot and scientist Odd Dahl joined the expedition and documented the wintering over and the first efforts to fly in the Arctic. But the plane crashed on just its second landing.
This is a beautiful small model of Maud made by one of the crew, Odd Dahl, who was very clever with building things. So it's very useful to look at the models when you're going to prepare for a lifting operation.
Although the scientific element of the expedition proved hugely successful, Maud failed to deliver the first crossing of the North Pole, despite spending 6 years in the ice floes. In 1925, the Maud and her crew were called back to Nome, Alaska, to meet Amundsen's creditors. The Maud was sold to the Hudson Bay Company to pay off the explorer's debts. Amundsen eventually made the polar crossing in the Norge airship, but disappeared a few years later while flying a rescue mission in the Arctic. His correspondence, skis, snowshoes and other remnants from his life on the Maud were preserved and today are on display here at the Fram Museum of Polar Exploration.
We have to remember that all through this time they did the scientific research. So that part of the expedition was successful, but that's not what reaches the public, because they want to know when Amundsen reached the North Pole. So in this way he had a problem with promoting the project towards the investors. So in this way the project was sort of double-sided.
The Hudson Bay Company renamed the ship Bay Maud and sailed her to Cambridge Bay, where she sank in shallow waters in 1930. Soon after sinking, Maud's top decks were plundered away for firewood and scrap by the Hudson Bay Company and needy locals, leaving only a row of ragged timbers sticking up out of the ice like the skeleton of a whale.
This was 1930. You know, the world was not prosperous. It was hard times, and to actually bring this ship back to Norway never became a realistic wish, even though the ship played an important role in the Norwegian polar research and the Norwegian history and the Amundsen story.
In 1991, the municipality of Asker, Norway, approached the Hudson Bay Company about purchasing the Maud, which was sold for $1 Canadian. But Asker never managed to bring the ship back. In autumn of 2010, the Tandberg brothers, 3 local developers, decided to save the Maud. A dream was born of repatriating the remains of the old polar ship and building a museum. The Tandbergs hired Jan, who had studied industrial design but had never done a ship salvage, much less a project this complex, with a shipwreck weighing several hundred tons deep in the frozen Northwest Passage. Naval architects and marine conservation specialists helped make structural calculations. Jan approached the salvage much like a polar expedition, with a settled crew that would follow the operation from beginning to end. Bjorn Miran is Jan's right-hand man, loyally by his side for more than 30 years.
I know Jan for at least 45 years, and when this project came on, he asked me to follow him, because I always hanged around him, you know. And I might call me his left hand, because he is left-handed.
They work by the Norwegian method, says Bjorn. They talk. They take the time it takes. They troubleshoot problems on their own. Jan arrived in Cambridge Bay in the summer of 2011 and first approached the Inuit elders and locals about the old shipwreck. They welcomed the Norwegians with traditional singing and drumming. Then he and an underwater photographer took their first dive to survey the ship. Above water, the Maud looked in rough condition. But what Jan saw on his first dive beneath the frigid waters astonished him.
But when I went down under the water, it's very close to the shore. There was a wall, a massive wall meeting me. And you know, it's a big ship. It's at least for a human being to meet it, it's very big, and it was like a little bit scary, I must admit, the first times.
The main deck, the oak hull, everything that was below the waterline had been amazingly preserved.
And I had a knife, and I knocked the knife into the wood, and my knife bounced on the wood. You know, it was stone hard.
But he immediately noticed another environmental aspect that would haunt him the next 4 summers. A layer of extremely fine river delta silt that with just a wave of the hand would swirl up around the ship, blocking visibility for hours until it had settled again. That month, Jan investigated every corner of the wreck and deemed the oak still strong enough to handle a salvage operation and be sailed home.
And I started to swim around, and I could see that this ship looks like a ship that was actually could float. So straight away I had the feeling that this ship has been preserved by the nature over all these years. Even though the ice has torn and worn it, it was still in a very good condition.
The team flew back to Norway and immediately began planning. They reapplied for the Canadian permit, which was at first rejected by a committee who felt the wreck should remain in place. The Norwegians appealed, pleading with the Canadians to consider the Maud's importance for Norwegian and polar exploration history. They presented a detailed plan for financing, salvage, and eventual placement in a museum in Vålen. They got the permit. It was clear the team would need to hire a barge and tug. Jan found a massive barge on sale online that had been intended for use on oil platforms. They bought it from Statoil and named it Jensen, after the man who built Maud. The barge would, however, need to be adapted in order to be able to carry the Maud. It was fitted with steel crossbeams in a shipyard before being sailed back to Vålen, where more custom fittings would have to be made. Winter settled in at Munkesletten, and there was little work to be done. Jan returned to Cambridge Bay in December to see the Maud in winter conditions. He took an enormous risk and dived under the ice to see how she was faring. Outside, it was -40. They drilled holes in the ice for lights.
There was a roof over us and we saw that the ship was framed in the ice and we had lights through the ice, so it was a beautiful view and it was more like something I will carry with me. And also we could photograph the situation above the ice and give people an understanding of all the years that Maud has been laying there waiting for something to happen. I don't know.
Jan also visited the Carnegie Institute to do more research on Amundsen's story and the history of the Maud. In the spring, Stig Pettersen heard about the ambitious plan to raise and return the Maud using the retrofitted barge. A construction worker and son of a fisherman from Lofoten, Pettersen also had no ship salvage experience. But he could keep almost anything running. The beat-up Volvo station wagon he drives has 600,000 kilometers on the clock and has never been in a repair shop. He was passionate about polar exploration and desperately wanted to come on board the expedition.
I just asked him if he needed an extra man, and now he said he did not, but if I was interested I could come out here and visiting them. And he heard that I was from Lofoten and he also has lived many years in Lofoten, so we kind of find the tone. And I came out here visiting them and helped them with the things on board.
The Tandbergs bought a splendid Norwegian farm complex on the beach at Munkesletten near Vålen and made it the headquarters for the Maud Returns Home expedition. They also bought an old used tug and named it Tandberg Polar. As preparations were underway, Stig showed up every day, fixing this on the tug or adjusting that on the barge. There was much to be done to prepare both vessels for the Atlantic crossing, with all the equipment on board that would be needed once in Cambridge Bay.
Like in the weekends I came out here and helped them, and also some evenings. And then it just became natural, and one day Jan asked me if I wanted to join them, and of course I wanted to join them.
By summer 2014, the expedition was ready to go. The team would take the Tandberg Polar, towing the Jensen barge, with balloons, generators, air compressors, and all the equipment necessary to save the Maud. On Midsummer's Night in 2014, the team set sail from Munkesletten, out from the Oslo Fjord and the coast of Norway, headed across the Atlantic Ocean. After 10 days of smooth sailing, they hit a hurricane-force storm in the middle of the Atlantic.
Oh, it was pretty rough. And in the first, we didn't know the tugboat, so it was a bit scary the first 24 hours, just to know that the tugboat could take it. So, and it lasted for 3 or 4 days.
Walls of green water shook their tug, which rose and fell in the massive seas. the barge was battered and lost some of its load.
We had what's called green sea on the bridge. I guess it was maybe 5 times. And green sea then is not good because then the windows can break and then you are not comfortable if the sea breaks the windows. On the bridge, 10 meters over the surface.
After the storm, the crew assessed and repaired the damage. One of their best generators had been damaged, but both the tug and the barge had survived. In mid-July, the team passed Iceland and arrived in Nuuk, the capital of Greenland. There was still too much ice to pass through the Northwest Passage. They hunkered down for a month in Greenland, waiting for the ice breakup. On September the 7th, the Tandberg Polar and the Jensen arrived in Cambridge Bay. It was an enormous step forward, but ice would soon set in again. Jan flew a kite over the Maud to get a bird's-eye view. As the ice closed in around them, it became clear the lifting operation would have to be delayed for yet another summer. Jan flew the kite one last time over Maud, now frozen solid in the ice. On September the 27th, with snow and ice enveloping the bay, the team departed once again. Once the ice broke up around the Maud in the summer of 2015, the hard work on the lift could begin again. At the shore closest to Maud, the team created a base camp, equipped with an old green couch and the basic equipment needed for diving. Jan stayed in an apartment in Cambridge Bay, where he could sleep, eat, dry clothes, and prepare for the grueling schedule of 2 dives each day, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. Stig and Bjorn stayed on the Tandberg Polar, from which they would fish, giving them sustenance and something to trade with the locals. The technique the team planned to use was to take dozens of balloons out into the sea around Maud and fill them up with air so that they would lift the wreck from the sea floor. It was a tedious and tiring job. As the diver, Jan had the hardest job, working underwater in frigid temperatures to fix all the ropes and strap them around the Maud and connect the balloons onto her sides. Bjorn adjusted and fixed the hoses and took care of general logistics for the team, while Stig kept the engines, generators and compressors running on the tug. Jan had his hands full underwater, where the airbags proved difficult to manage. Balloons kept popping up to the surface. It was hard to know where to tie the ropes. There were air leaks that Jan had to fix while underwater. Silt was easily stirred up, delaying the work. But the biggest problem was simple physics. The Maud was waterlogged and heavier than they originally believed. The balloons did not seem to have enough lifting power to make her budge. The team was at a loss. They could not ship in additional balloons. But perhaps, they thought, they could make better use of what they had. They decided on a risky but innovative retrofitting solution. They would cut the balloons in half and use them vertically, like parachutes.
We started to cut one airbag in 2 and make this parachute, but we realized the same day that this was working extremely well, and then we could attach the airbags very close together, and we haven't seen these airbags being cut in 2 before, so we was a little bit curious if this was okay. But after a few days we had cut more and more, and at the end we had more than 20 or 25 of these these parachutes, and each sort of underwater parachute is filled with air, and it lifts up maybe 3 to 4 tons of lifting power each bag.
Amazingly, the balloons in their upright position had more lifting power. Then, all of a sudden, Jan noticed something different. It was a turning point in their whole adventure.
Yeah, of course I'm up and down, and, but basically I have to attach everything down under the water. So we attached the front of the mod with the strapping system underneath, and we started to put pressure on her. And I saw that this doesn't look familiar. It was some new. My eyes saw something new, and I just realized it had come up like 30 centimeters, the whole keel. And I just then realized that the whole ship was actually lifting, which is a big moment, of course. But it was like, okay, now it's happened. And when I came up to the surface, I also understood that the other guys had seen it.
I guess I was in my very good sofa ashore, because I have a very good view from there. But when I realized it was racing, I went out to the tugboat, because I promised the guy to jump into the sea if when it raised. And it was a big moment, a really big moment. We have worked 4 years for it.
I was standing in the middle of the ship on the small raft, and just steering the airflow to the balloons. And yes, I could see it, because the ship was just a little underwater on just on both the port and starboard side. So when the wood came over the water, we know that it has happened.
They were able to tilt the ship into an upright position. It was the first major step toward a successful salvage. The tilt was key to helping determine Maud's exact weight, but there would not be enough time to carry out the full lift. They would need more balloons, which they had begun calling vertical parachutes, and these would need to be ordered specially. It would mean another delay of yet another year.
We had been there for a couple of months and working very hard, and realizing that we are not going to lift Maud this summer. But we have experienced what we need to know that it's going to happen.
That winter, the team of 3 met to go over every detail of their plan, troubleshooting what could go wrong and making sure they were prepared for every possible repair.
So, and the first summer was a very obvious trying and failing process. And you can say that, okay, maybe we should have understood more before, but it's so particular, this project, and the way Maud was positioned, and also the potential vulnerability of this ship. We feel good that we took the time to find out in detail how we should do it.
The team ordered more balloons and additional high-tech, super light and super strong rope from China. Down at the boathouse, the team also kept a 1:20 scale model of the Maud and barge, which they had built to test out in a variety of conditions. They would make little adaptations. Then Jan would kayak out into the frozen waters, trailing the barge and Maud behind, to see how she behaved in choppy seas.
And the parachutes, we call them parachutes later on, but they start as lifting bags. And we had the ropes, very strong ropes, from Hydema Spectra rope, which is as strong as wire, but much lighter. These are very important elements. And then we have the air compressors in the ship, and also we have independent small compressors that can produce air, so we can fill the airbags and also fill the air tanks for my diving.
Concerned about the state of the tug and the need to have all the generators and compressors working properly, Stig and Jan went to Cambridge Bay a month ahead. along with trusted mechanic Han Terje, who works in the Lofoten shipyard.
I don't think you can have a better man for the purpose. So I have learned a lot. I'm really grateful to work with Terje. I learned very much.
To their dismay, after servicing, one of the generators refused to start.
You have a lot of pressure on you because it was 38 minus and we could not be without power for a day. Then we will break a lot of the system on board. So even if it's not so very difficult, you feel that it's more difficult when you have to make it in short time. Otherwise it have big consequences.
But the team was able to troubleshoot the generator repair and go back to Norway to wait for the ice breakup. Everything was ready to go.
Well, when we arrived in June 2016, we had the winter of relaxing and thinking about what we had experienced, and we felt good arriving in June and waiting for the ice to open. And around 1st of July in 2016, the ice opens around the Maud, and we could access for diving and also start the operation of continuing where we stopped last season.
The ropes had been laid beneath the Maud the summer before, and the balloons now had 150 to 200 tons of potential lifting power. All the balloons had to be refilled each morning, a process that took anywhere from 30 minutes to a few hours before Jan's dive would begin. It was a morning routine that involved checking and connecting the hoses, pumps, air compressors and multiple generators located on the barge, Tandberg Polar tug and smaller rafts being used in the operation.
We have 2 big tanks for starting air, and this is the one we are using for fill up all the balloons, and the compressor are big enough to keep up the air pressure even if we use air all the time. We never run out of air. Two compressors, yes, to load the start air. And then we have 2 generators, these 2 ones. And then we have, on the deck, we have 2 separate generators that we use for, in the winter we use one of them to heaten up the tug, to support the tug with the power. So one of these has actually been running for 2 years over the winter, keeping the boat warm in 50 minus.
6 cables connected the deck generators on the tug to the pumps on the barge. An additional small generator on the barge ran 2 very large pumps. Connecting all of this were 18 hoses carrying air to the balloons. The hoses could not get hung up on the boat. Losing a hose and risking the balloon filling with water was a risk they couldn't afford. There was no nearby mechanic or parts shop. Everything had to be repaired with what they had brought with them. Stig passed balloons to Jan and followed his position beneath the water from above the surface on a small raft, watching for the telltale bubbles that gave away Jan's position below, trying to guess what tool he might need, trying to anticipate any problems that could arise.
So sometimes he disappeared for me. And it's a little worrying because we have only one diver and you need to have control on where he is. Mostly I knew what he was going to do, so I knew where he was going to do work. And I tried to be there because it always happens something. He needs some ropes or air or anything.
Finally, after a week of preparations and adding balloons, the team could feel there was beginning to be some movement. Stig moved to the middle of the raft over the Maud to support Jan, who was swimming around the Maud, topping up all their balloons with as much air as they could take. It had to happen.
We had used all our buoyancy balloons, and we had not space to put any more, so it felt like it has to, and we, of course, we could feel that Maud was rolling from one side to the other. When we was putting air on one side, it moved over, so we could feel that it could not be so very far away, but we needed to have it from the seafloor, and so it's not enough to be close. So when it finally came up, it just felt unreal.
With her keel free, a whole new chapter of the salvage could begin. Raising the Maud off the sea floor was the make or break moment of this salvage operation.
At the end of July, we had put more or less everything we had of airbags, and finally we had the lift of Maud. So the whole keel came free from the seabed, and Maud was floating in the surface. She didn't show anything of herself above the water, but she was free from the seabed, so we could move her around as we want. And that was extremely useful, because then we had phase one sort of done, and then we can move into phase two, and that involves the barge Jensen that we had brought from Norway, which is also going to be the one to be used for towing Maud back to Norway. And the barge was then, at the moment when we had Maud floating, the next day we started to sink the barge down to the seabed.
Freeing up the Maud from the seabed marked the end of phase one of the salvage. Phase two would be submerging the barge and maneuvering the Maud onto it in order to eventually lift her to the surface.
And so it was actually standing on the seabed, and we could, I guess this shows best. Here you see Jensen floats, and here she goes down to the seabed and lays on the seabed. And over the barge, between the barge and the surface of the water, there is space enough to maneuver Maud in a floating position, maneuver her over the barge, and then we can prepare for the lifting of the barge with Maud on top, which is a simple operation, technically, but still we hadn't seen it done before, so we were cautious about whatever could happen.
Lifting the Maud out of the sea, however, presented considerable risks, as no one really knew how solid her joints were, or where the actual center of gravity of the ship was.
But basically we just started to lift the front of the Jensen with the help of pumping the water out of the inside of Jensen. So in this way giving her more buoyancy. And then she started to push Maud out of the water, because Jensen has the potential buoyancy when she's empty from water to carry Maud in a floating position.
As the team lifted the front of the Jensen by pumping water out of its chambers, the Maud began to rise above the surface, to the delight of locals who began gathering at the shore to watch. However, Jan and his team had to keep the Jensen resting on the seabed to provide leverage and stability. As the more the Maud rose out of the water, the higher her center of gravity became, and with it, the risk she could topple off the barge. Once in the shallows, the team could raise the Maud out of the water and still have the barge under her resting on the seabed, to give stability, while they worked to free a century of debris from the wreck and stabilize it further. Then she could be raised fully out of the water.
If we lift Jensen up in the back part, it could be critical, because then we will risk that it could tip over, because the center of gravity is very high. So in this way, to avoid this risk, we reduce the weight of Jensen on the seabed by pumping water out. And then when she came close to being neutral, we had the opportunity to pull her slowly, but very close to the seabed, backwards into more shallow water.
Once the Maud was fully out of the water, the Tandberg brothers, who had sponsored the whole operation, arrived. The team hoisted the Maud's pennant. It was a triumph of tenacity and teamwork, a dream come true for the Tandbergs and the entire Maud Returns Home team, who had finally proven the naysayers wrong. It could be done. It had been done.
And this worked basically according to our plan, and it happened only in 1 week, 1.5 weeks, after months of fighting the airbag issue. We saw Maud coming up and show her beauty. And it was a happy moment for everybody. And when she was up in the floating position, we could put the old Maud flag up and have a little celebration.
Yeah, the boat is very spectacular. All the colors is the things that make most impression on me is the special color on the boat, inside the boat, everywhere. It is this glowing when the sun is shining on it. Is fantastic.
The Maud might have been raised, but the hard work was just beginning. She was full of debris, literally tons of mud and iron and steel. Amazingly, they found tools that had been used by Amundsen himself, even storage boxes with his name emblazoned on the side. Every foray into the Maud brought new surprises, and by watching the historical footage of the Maud expedition, they recognized objects that were being rediscovered a century later, still amazingly preserved, frozen in time by the sub-zero Arctic environment.
I'm very happy about that the Tandberg took the initiative to save the ship. They came when the boat was half up. So and they were staying for 2 days, I think, 2-3 days. Oh, it was great. They were very enthusiastic, and also they worked a lot when they was helping, and they were not afraid to dig in the dirt and do a physical job on the project. That is also very nice.
In September 2016, the ice began to close in around the Maud once again, freezing her atop the barge for the winter. The team returned to Asker to plan for the final phase, towing the Maud slowly back to Norway via Russia.
Our hope is to be able to return to Norway the same way as Maud came, because Maud sailed this way to the Bering Strait before they wanted to do the drift over the North Pole. So it would be interesting for us to sail the same waters as Maud arrived.
Thanks to a group of hardy Norwegians who dared to dream, Maud may finally return home from the Arctic ice that never managed to destroy her. And this time, she's coming home for good.